Cause I'm just going to pray. The disbeliever's going to hate. Habibi, I'm just going to shake. Shake it off.
Hi everyone. Every now and then, I will jump in on these videos to speed things up a bit when topics are going to be lengthy. Sheikh Itoff is currently reading The History of Al-Tabari, Volume 8, pages 1 to 4. He is currently reading about an incident where Muhammad went to visit his adopted son Zayd at Zayd's house. Unfortunately, Zayd was not in, and Muhammad was greeted by Zayd's wife, Zaynab, who had dressed in haste before she answered the door. Given that she was wearing very little clothing and Muhammad was a pervert, she excited the admiration of the messenger of God, and he started murmuring something that could scarcely be understood. However, he did say overtly,
"Glory be to God the Almighty. Glory be to God who causes hearts to turn."
Anyway, you have the reference so you can read the story for yourself, but long story short, Zayd heard that Muhammad was lusting after his wife, so offered to divorce her, so that Muhammad could marry her.
Messenger of God, perhaps Zaynab has excited your admiration, and so I will separate myself from her.
Muhammad, being the noble man that he was, rejected the offer.
Keep your wife to yourself.
After all, how could he possibly take the wife of his own adopted son? Knowing that Muhammad was lusting after his wife, Zayd couldn't take it anymore and divorced Zaynab. And that's when Muhammad received one of his special revelations.
Surah 33, verse 37. And remember, when you said to him on whom Allah has bestowed grace and you have done favor, keep your wife to yourself and fear Allah. But you did hide in yourself that which Allah will make manifest. You did fear the people, whereas Allah had a better right that you should fear Him. So when Zayd had accomplished his desire from her, i.e. divorced her, we gave her to you in marriage, so that in future there may be no difficulty to the believers in respect of the marriage of the wives of their adopted sons when the latter have no desire to keep them, i.e. they have divorced them. And Allah's command must be fulfilled. It's just mind-boggling that people believe this comes from God.
Sheikh Itoff is now watching Yasir Qadhi give a lecture about this incident. The lecture goes for nearly an hour and a half, so I won't subject you to a grown man trying to rationalize this incident when it's obvious to anyone with half a brain that Muhammad has just come up with this revelation so he can take Zaynab for himself. I will, however, link the lecture in the description box in case you want to see the entire thing. To summarize, Qadhi explains that there are two versions of this story. Version A, which Qadhi describes as problematic.
Version A is the problematic version. Version A is the version that has caused a lot of criticism. And it is found in a lot of detail in many books.
Version A is the version of events which is found in Islam's earliest sources.
Zayd comes back, this is from Ibn Sa'd, and Zaynab tells him the Prophet ﷺ visited. He said, "Why didn't you invite him in?" She said, "I did." He said, "What did he say?" Zaynab said, "I don't know, but all I could hear was Subhanallah al-Azim, Subhana Musarrif al-Qulub." So Zayd understood that perhaps the Prophet ﷺ was inclined towards her. Zayd understood that perhaps the Prophet, Zaynab did not understand. Zayd understood by Subhana Musarrif al-Qulub that perhaps the Prophet ﷺ was inclined towards her.
It is also found in Al-Tabari, which is what Sheikh Itoff just read.
Al-Tabari mentions version A as basically the only version. It's the standard version. And he mentions reports from Qatada and from Ibn Zayd and from other authorities that explicitly mention version A and basically support this version.
Who was Al-Tabari?
And Al-Tabari is the most orthodox, the most authentic, the encyclopedia of tafsirs. This is the bastion of Sunni tafsirs. All tafsirs come from Al-Tabari. Al-Tabari is the polymath, he's the historian, he's the seerah expert, he's the mufassir. This is Al-Tabari. Al-Tabari is who Al-Tabari is. He is one of the, in fact, frankly, he is the greatest scholar of tafsir of the early centuries. Nobody is greater than Al-Tabari.
Qadhi goes on to explain the second version of events, version B, is not actually an incident or story, it's just an interpretation.
Version B is not actually a specific incident, it's an interpretation. It's not a story. Version A is a story. Version B is no story. It's simply an interpretation of the verse.
And it's not actually mentioned until over 400 years after Muhammad and his followers migrated from Mecca to Medina.
And what is this interpretation, and where is the first book that mentions it? Well, the first printed book that I could find that mentions this is Al-Bayhaqi's Dala'il al-Nubuwah, and Al-Bayhaqi died 458 Hijrah.
So, what is version B?
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had informed the Prophet ﷺ that Zaynab would become his wife. Now, pause here. That's version B. That's all version B.
Qadhi goes on to explain that as centuries pass by, scholars begin to throw out version A of events.
People begin to say version B is better, let's just ignore version A.
Using sound reasoning as to why version B is the correct interpretation.
So, Baghawi says, I think version B is better, because that would make our life easier.
And that scholars also start making up their own interpretations with no sources to back them up.
Ibn al-Jawzi removes the love factor completely, removes the inclination factor. And he says he wanted to marry her to take care of her because she's his cousin. But he doesn't actually quote an authority. He simply says this is better really he is a modified version B basically, right?
And yes, you heard that correctly. Zaynab was not only the divorced wife of Muhammad's adopted son, she was also Muhammad's cousin. Anyway, you can go and watch the lecture for yourself, but just to recap, Muhammad married the divorced wife of his own adopted son. The vast majority of the earliest Islamic sources explain this happened after Muhammad was lusting after her, causing her marriage with his adopted son to deteriorate. Later Muslims then got embarrassed by this. I couldn't possibly imagine why, so they invented a new interpretation. This new interpretation is simply that Muhammad wasn't lusting after Zaynab, but that he had just been told by Allah that he was supposed to marry her, and he was embarrassed by this. Either way, Muhammad married a woman who was not only the divorced wife of his own adopted son, but also a woman who was his cousin.
Muhammad, I've just read about your marriage to Zaynab. I don't mean to question you, but I do have to ask, is wondering whether or not it's okay to marry the divorced wife of your own adopted son really something people need divine guidance on? I mean, apart from you, I've never met anybody that had this problem before.
Shake it off. You may not hear about it, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Just like the tens of thousands of Islamic terror attacks which have occurred in just over the last 2 decades alone.
Well, I mean, even so, is it that important that Allah not only needed to mention it in His eternal speech, but that He also needed you to do it? Couldn't He just have said that it's okay for men to marry the divorced wives of their own adopted sons and leave it at that?
Shake it off. Need I not remind you that once I have made a decision, I mean once Allah has made a decision, that it is not for anyone to take another option. Besides, adopted sons don't count as sons anymore anyway. People started complaining about me taking the divorced wife of my own adopted son.
Muhammad has married the wife of his son while forbidding people from doing the same.
And that's when Allah intervened and revealed Surah 33 verse 4 of the Quran, saying that adopted sons aren't actually your real sons.
But Muhammad, if there are no more adopted sons in Islam, then Surah 33 verse 37, which gives divine guidance to those who are wondering whether or not it's okay to marry the divorced wives of their own adopted sons, makes absolutely no sense. No Muslim will ever be in the position that you were ever again, because there are no more adopted sons in Islam.
Hold that thought. I'm receiving a special revelation from Allah. Allah is telling me to tell you that it's time to stop asking questions and that it's time for me to leave. I need to go and have sex with all 9 of my wives and then take a single bath. Let's pick this conversation up some other time. And by some other time, I mean ask again and you'll be executed. Let us not question what Allah has decreed.
How convenient.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you would like to see more videos like these, please consider supporting me on Patreon. You can also find me on X and Rumble.
Islam's not for me.
Islam's not